The Adventure of the Aztec Death Mask. It was a wild evening in early November of the year 1895. One of those nights when the wind howls down Baker Street like a living thing, rattling the windows and driving the rain in furious sheets against the glass. Holmes and I had dined early, and I had settled into my armchair with the latest number of the Lancet, while my friend, reclining upon the sofa, amused himself by scraping a series of mournful airs upon his violin. The fire burned brightly, casting a cheerful glow over our familiar sitting room, and I confess I was on the point of dozing when the bell rang with unusual violence. Mrs. Hudson, ever patient despite the lateness of the hour, presently appeared to announce a visitor. "Sir Reginald Hargreaves," she said, "and in a rare taking, if I may say so, sir." "Show him up at once," said Holmes, laying aside his Stradivarius with alacrity. There was that gleam in his eye which I had come to recognize as the herald of interesting events. A moment later, our visitor was ushered in. A tall, spare man of perhaps 60 years, with the bearing of one accustomed to command, yet whose face was drawn and whose eyes betrayed the deepest anxiety. His overcoat was drenched, and raindrops glistened upon his grey beard as he advanced toward the fire, rubbing his hands together as though to restore circulation. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he inquired, glancing from one to the other of us. "At your service," replied my friend, motioning him to the basket chair opposite his own. "This is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson, in whose discretion you may place entire confidence. Pray take a glass of whisky and soda. The night is inclement." Sir Reginald accepted the hospitality with gratitude, and when he had warmed himself a little, he began his narrative in a voice that trembled with suppressed emotion. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "I have come to you as a man who stands upon the brink of ruin, nay, worse, of terror. For 8 months past, my household has been visited by a series of deaths so mysterious, so inexplicable, that the local physicians are utterly baffled, and even the servants whisper of a curse. 3 persons, 3 innocent souls, have perished in exactly the same dreadful manner, and I myself live in hourly dread that I may be the next." Holmes leaned forward, his thin, eager face illuminated by the firelight. "Pray be precise, Sir Reginald. Dates, symptoms, circumstances, every detail is of importance." Our visitor drew a deep breath. "The first was my housekeeper, Mrs. Ellison, a woman of 50, strong and healthy, who had been in my service for 20 years. 8 months ago she took ill suddenly, high fever, a racking cough that brought up blood, rapid wasting of the flesh. She died within a week. The doctors spoke of acute pneumonia, but confessed themselves puzzled. 4 months later, the same fate overtook my only son, Captain Arthur Hargreaves, just returned from India. He had been in perfect health, yet within days of his arrival he exhibited the identical symptoms and was dead before a fortnight had passed. The third victim, only 3 weeks ago, was my old college friend, Professor Langdale, the archaeologist. He came to stay for a few days, and he too was stricken in precisely the same way. He managed to return to London, but died shortly after reaching his home. I could not repress an exclamation of sympathy, but Holmes remained silent, his fingertips pressed together, his eyes fixed upon our visitor. "There is a common link," continued Sir Reginald, his voice sinking almost to a whisper. "An object which each of the 3 handled shortly before their illness. An ancient Aztec death mask of obsidian and turquoise mosaic, the finest example in private hands in England, or so I was assured when I purchased it 18 months ago. I myself have never touched it. It has stood upon its pedestal beneath a glass dome in my drawing room at Netley Grange near Southampton. Yet the coincidence is too dreadful to ignore. The servants are leaving, the neighbourhood shuns the house, and I hardly know whether I confront a supernatural vengeance or some deadly human agency." Holmes's eyes sparkled. "You interest me extremely, Sir Reginald. Curses, as a rule, prove upon examination to have a very terrestrial origin. You shall tell me the exact circumstances of each handling of the mask. But first, Have you any suspicion of a human hand in this affair? The baronet hesitated. None that I can name. Yet there is a distant cousin, a Mr. Felix Carver, who would inherit should my direct line fail. He is an enthusiastic amateur of antiquities and was instrumental in my acquiring the mask. But I cannot bring myself to suspect. Leave suspicion to me, interrupted Holmes briskly. I shall accompany you to Netley Grange tomorrow. Watson, you will come? I assented eagerly, and after a few further questions our visitor departed, somewhat comforted, into the stormy night. When the door had closed behind him, Holmes sprang to his feet with that characteristic energy which told me the chase was on. A capital case, Watson. 3 deaths, identical symptoms, a single object in common, and the owner untouched. Mark my words, we shall find no wrathful Aztec spirit, but something far more prosaic and far more deadly. The following morning broke cold and clear, with a pale, wintry sun struggling through the haze that hung over the Thames. Holmes and I took the early train from Waterloo to Southampton, and a dog-cart conveyed us the remaining miles to Netley Grange. The house proved to be a handsome Georgian mansion of red brick, standing in well-timbered grounds that sloped gently toward the Solent. As we bowled up the gravel drive, I could not help remarking the air of melancholy that seemed to brood over the place, the drawn blinds in several windows, the untended leaves that lay thick upon the lawn, the absence of any servant visible upon our approach. Sir Reginald received us in the hall, his anxiety but little diminished by a night's reflection. He conducted us at once to the drawing-room, a spacious apartment panelled in oak and furnished with quiet elegance. At the far end, upon a pedestal of carved ebony and beneath a dome of thick glass, reposed the object that had brought us thither, the Aztec death mask. Even to my untutored eye, it was a thing of singular and sinister beauty. The face was fashioned from polished black obsidian, so deeply reflective that it seemed almost liquid, inlaid with intricate mosaics of turquoise that formed the features. High cheekbones, a broad nose, a mouth set in an enigmatic half-smile. The eyes were mere hollow sockets, yet they appeared to follow one about the room with a lifelike intensity. Around the brow ran a band of feather-like ornaments, and the whole gave the impression of a high priest or monarch, frozen at the moment of some awful ritual. Holmes approached it with the cautious eagerness of a naturalist examining a rare and dangerous specimen. He first walked slowly about the pedestal, noting the position of every article of furniture in relation to it, the direction of the light from the tall windows, the faint layer of dust upon the glass dome. Then, drawing on a pair of thin kid gloves, he lifted the dome with infinite care and set it aside. "Observe, Watson," said he in a low voice. "The mask has not been moved from its exact position for some weeks. Note the undisturbed dust upon the velvet base. Yet when disturbed, as our client assures us, it becomes the harbinger of death." He bent close, his aquiline nose almost touching the obsidian surface, and inhaled gently. A faint odor, musty, fungal, scarcely perceptible, yet unmistakable to a trained sense. And here, he indicated with a long forefinger the hollow interior visible through the eye sockets. Minute black specks like soot adhering to the inner surface. Curious, most curious. Sir Reginald, who'd been watching with painful interest, now spoke. "I have never laid hand upon it myself, Mr. Holmes. From the day it arrived, it has stood exactly thus, save when those poor souls handled it." "Precisely," returned Holmes, "and you shall now recount to me the exact circumstances of each occasion. But first, pray ring for your butler, or whichever servant is most familiar with the daily routine of the house. Every trifling detail may prove of importance." While we awaited the servant, Holmes continued his examination. He produced his powerful lens and scrutinized every inch of the mask's exterior, paying particular attention to the join between the obsidian face and the mosaic border. At one point he gave a low exclamation of satisfaction. "There is a hairline seam here, Watson, at the back of the head. almost invisible to the naked eye. It suggests a possible cavity within, perhaps for the reception of ritual offerings in ancient times. Such masks were sometimes hollow, were they not, Sir Reginald? The baronet nodded. So the dealer assured me. He claimed it had been recovered from a temple cache near Mexico City, and that its hollow interior once contained incense or precious stones. Holmes's eyes gleamed. A hollow interior, sealed for centuries perhaps, and now open to the English climate. Interesting. Most interesting. The butler, an elderly man named Grayson, now entered, visibly nervous. Under Holmes's gentle but persistent questioning, he confirmed that the mask had been left entirely undisturbed for long periods without ill effect, but that each death had followed closely upon its being lifted or examined. He added that Mr. Felix Carver, the cousin, had visited several times and always evinced the keenest interest in the piece, once suggesting that it might be displayed to better advantage in a different position. When the man had withdrawn, Holmes turned to Sir Reginald with that air of quiet command which invariably imposed obedience. "I shall require, sir, certain articles belonging to the deceased, particularly any gloves, handkerchiefs or clothing worn at the time they handled the mask. Also, access to whatever correspondence passed between yourself and the vendor. And finally, I should like to see the room occupied by Professor Langdale during his fatal visit." Sir Reginald bowed to these requests, and as he left to give the necessary orders, Holmes stood for some moments in silent contemplation of the mask, his thin hands clasped behind him, his brow contracted in thought. "A pretty problem, Watson," he murmured at length. 3 deaths, identical in symptoms, each linked to the disturbance of this single object, yet the owner untouched. We have here either the most malignant of curses or the most ingenious of human contrivances. I confess I inclined toward the latter. After Holmes had completed his preliminary examination of the mask, Sir Reginald led us to his library, a comfortable room lined with books and adorned with various curios from his travels. A coal fire crackled in the grate, and the baronet, having fortified himself with a glass of port, settled into a leather armchair to recount the melancholy history in greater detail. Holmes sat opposite, his elbows upon the arms of his chair, his fingertips pressed together, while I took notes upon my shirt cuff in the manner to which I had become accustomed. "The mask arrived at Netley Grange some 18 months ago," began Sir Reginald, "packed in a crate lined with native cotton and accompanied by papers attesting its provenance from a temple near Tenochtitlan. I purchased it privately through the good offices of my cousin, Mr. Felix Carver, who has connections among collectors in Mexico. It was placed upon its pedestal the very day it arrived, and there it has remained save on the 3 fatal occasions I am about to describe. The first was 8 months past. Mrs. Ellison, my housekeeper, a most trustworthy woman, had been instructed never to touch the object, but in her zeal for cleanliness, she took it upon herself one morning to remove the glass dome and dust both pedestal and mask. She lifted the piece carefully, turning it a little that the light might catch the turquoise inlay to better advantage, then wiped the interior with a soft cloth before replacing it. 3 days later she complained of a slight chill. By the 5th day she was prostrate with high fever and a cough that brought up flecks of blood. The local physician diagnosed acute inflammation of the lungs, but despite every remedy she sank rapidly and died within the week. At the time we thought it a tragic but natural misfortune. 4 months ago my son, Captain Arthur Hargreaves, returned from his regiment in India. He had always shared my interest in antiquities, and on the evening of his arrival he expressed a desire to examine the mask more closely. I cautioned him against handling it unnecessarily, but he laughed at my scruples, saying that a soldier who had faced Afridi bullets need not fear an old Mexican relic. He removed the dome, lifted the mask, and held it to the lamplight, peering into the hollow interior and remarking upon the exquisite workmanship. He even traced the mosaic pattern with his finger. 2 days later he awoke with headache and fever. The dreadful cough began on the 3rd day, and by the 10th he was gone. The doctors spoke of galloping consumption, but confessed they had never seen a case progress with such fearful rapidity. The 3rd and most recent tragedy occurred only 3 weeks ago. Professor Langdale, you may know the name, Mr. Holmes, he is a recognized authority on pre-Columbian civilizations, came to stay for a few days. Naturally, he was eager to study the mask. On the evening before his departure, we were sitting in the drawing room after dinner. The conversation turned to ancient funeral rites, and Langdale, in a moment of levity, rose and placed the mask upon his face, declaring with mock solemnity that he would invoke the spirit of Tezcatlipoca for our entertainment. We all laughed, though I confess I felt a twinge of uneasiness, and he wore it for perhaps half a minute before replacing it upon the pedestal. He left for London the next morning in apparently perfect health and spirits. 2 days later, I received a telegram informing me that he had been taken suddenly ill. He died the following evening. The symptoms, Mr. Holmes, were identical in every particular: fever, hemorrhagic cough, rapid collapse. Sir Reginald paused, his voice breaking. 3 times the mask has been moved or handled. 3 times death has followed swiftly. Yet when it has stood undisturbed for weeks, nay, months, no harm has come to anyone. The servants are convinced it carries an Aztec curse. Several have given notice. I myself have never laid a finger upon it, and I am hale. But how long, Mr. Holmes? How long before the curse claims me, even at a distance? Holmes had listened to this recital with the closest attention, his eyes half closed, his expression inscrutable. When Sir Reginald ceased speaking, he remained silent for some moments, then opened his eyes and fixed them upon our host with that penetrating gaze which seemed to read the very thoughts. "You have done well to withhold nothing," said he at length. "The sequence is clear. Disturbance of the object, inhalation of some noxious agent, rapid onset of identical symptoms. We deal here not with vengeance from beyond the grave, but with a poison, subtle, insidious, and I suspect of comparatively modern introduction. Tomorrow, Sir Reginald, I shall require certain articles belonging to the deceased, and I shall pursue other lines of inquiry. Rest assured, the shadow that hangs over Netley Grange shall be lifted, and the author of these crimes, whether human or otherwise, brought to light." The 2 days that followed were a period of intense activity for my friend, such as I had witnessed many times before, yet never without a thrill of admiration at the boundless energy and precision he brought to bear upon a problem. While Sir Reginald, pale and anxious, kept as far from the drawing-room as decency permitted, Holmes established himself there with his portable chemical case, a powerful microscope borrowed from the local physician, and a series of glass dishes and slides that gave the apartment something of the air of a laboratory. I acted as his assistant, handing him specimens, noting down observations, and occasionally venturing a question which he would answer with that impatient tolerance reserved for my slower intellect. The articles belonging to the deceased had been brought to us: Mrs. Ellison's dusting cloth and apron still carefully preserved, the gloves Captain Arthur had worn on the evening he handled the mask, the handkerchief Professor Langdale had carried during his visit, stained with the first spots of blood from his fatal cough. Holmes began with these. Under his lens, the cloth and gloves revealed minute black particles, so fine as almost to escape notice, yet adhering stubbornly to the fibers. With a camel hair brush, he gathered samples into separate watch glasses, then prepared nutrient jelly in small petri dishes, a technique I had seen him employ in his bacteriological studies. Within hours, to my astonishment, dark velvety patches began to appear upon the jelly, spreading with alarming rapidity. "Observe, Watson," said he, holding one dish to the light. "A mould of extraordinary vigour. In its natural state it lies dormant, but given warmth, moisture and disturbance, it multiplies with prodigious speed. The spores are light, almost impalpable, and when inhaled in sufficient quantity produce precisely the symptoms described: inflammation of the lungs, hemorrhage, rapid toxemia. He now turned his attention to the mask itself. With Sir Reginald's reluctant permission, he removed it from its pedestal and carried it to a small anteroom that could be sealed. There, working with gloved hands and a fine probe, he examined the hairline seam he had detected on the first day. After some minutes of delicate manipulation, he gave a low exclamation of triumph. "Here we have it, Watson, the secret chamber." With infinite care, he eased away a thin obsidian plug, no larger than a sixpence, from the back of the head. Within the hollow interior lay a dark, spongy growth, black and velvety, filling perhaps a third of the cavity. When Holmes gently tilted the mask, a faint cloud of almost invisible dust arose, the deadly spores released by the slightest movement. The ancient makers fashioned this hollow for ritual purposes, incense perhaps, or offerings of blood, said Holmes. Centuries of seclusion in a dry temple vault preserved the conditions perfectly. But when our ingenious murderer introduced a virulent culture of this fungus, likely a strain of aspergillus or some even more toxic variety, the stage was set for tragedy. The spores lie quiescent when the mask is still, but the act of lifting, turning, or, worst of all, placing it upon the face, dislodges them in sufficient quantity to ensure a lethal dose for anyone who inhales them. I could not repress a shudder. But how did the miscreant introduce the culture without arousing suspicion? Holmes replaced the plug and sealed the mask temporarily in a glass jar. That is the next point to establish. The mask was in the vendor's possession for some time before delivery. A few hours' work in a darkened room, with a culture prepared in advance, would suffice. The plug is cunningly fitted, almost invisible unless sought for deliberately. He now dispatched a series of telegrams to a Harley Street lung specialist, to the British Museum's Department of Ethnology, to a former client in the city whose discretion was absolute. By evening, the replies began to arrive. The specialist confirmed that rare cases of fatal mycotoxicosis had been recorded among explorers who had opened sealed tombs in Egypt and Peru. The museum authority verified that certain Aztec masks were indeed constructed with concealed cavities. The city inquiry revealed something that brought a grim smile to my friend's lips. "Our cousin, Mr. Felix Carver," said he, folding the final telegram, "is deeper in debt than Sir Reginald suspects. Queues of creditors, gambling losses at Newmarket, and the tables at Monte Carlo, and, most suggestive, he has made discreet approaches to land agents regarding the valuation of Netley Grange in the event of a change of ownership." Holmes rose and paced the room with that restless energy which told me the end was in sight. The motive is clear: removal of the direct heirs, followed by inheritance or purchase at a fraction of the true value. The method, diabolically ingenious. Tomorrow, Watson, we shall lay a trap that even the cleverest murderer cannot evade. The mask shall be prepared for transport to the British Museum, and Mr. Carver shall be invited to witness the operation. I think we may confidently predict that he will betray himself. With the scientific aspects of the case now firmly established in his mind, Holmes turned his attention to the human element, the motive that had transformed an ancient relic into an instrument of murder. He lost no time in pursuing this new line of inquiry, and I soon found myself accompanying him on a series of discreet visits that carried us from Netley Grange to the offices of solicitors in Southampton and, by telegraph, to the great repositories of public records in London. Our first call was upon Sir Reginald's solicitor, Mr. Bartholomew Trent, a dry, precise gentleman whose chambers overlooked the High Street. Holmes, adopting the manner of a fellow collector anxious to verify provenance, drew the lawyer into conversation about the Hargreaves estate. Trent, though cautious, was flattered by my friend's apparent erudition and, after some skillful prompting, revealed that, while the baronetcy and the greater part of the property were entailed upon the direct male line, a substantial unentailed residue, comprising investments and certain valuable freehold land, would, in the absence of Sir Reginald and his son, pass to the nearest collateral heir, Mr. Felix Carver. Mr. Carver has made occasional inquiries, admitted Trent, adjusting his spectacles, as to the exact disposition of the unentailed portion. Perfectly natural, of course, in a prospective heir, though I confess his interest seemed unusually keen. From Southampton we proceeded to Somerset House by the next train, where Holmes's connections among the registry clerks enabled him to examine the relevant documents without delay. The results were illuminating. Felix Carver, aged 42, unmarried and resident in a modest flat in Bayswater, stood indeed next in succession. More damning still were the traces of his financial embarrassment. A judgment registered against him for unpaid gambling debts, a mortgage upon his few remaining unentailed acres in Dorset, and a series of promissory notes that spoke eloquently of habitual extravagance. Back at Netley Grange that evening, Holmes assembled the threads with his customary clarity as we sat before the fire in the library. "Consider the picture, Watson," said he, lighting his pipe and sending a cloud of blue smoke toward the ceiling. Felix Carver, poor, indebted, and aware that only 2 lives stand between him and a comfortable fortune. He is an amateur antiquarian with connections in Mexico. He learns of a genuine Aztec mask coming onto the market. What more natural than that he should urge his wealthy cousin to purchase it and offer to act as intermediary? The mask arrives in his hands first. He has ample opportunity, in the privacy of his own rooms, to prepare his deadly culture. A visit to any hospital or bacteriological laboratory would supply a virulent mold, Aspergillus flavus perhaps, or a strain of Stachybotrys known for its hemorrhagic toxins. Introduced into the concealed cavity, sealed with the original plug, the spores lie dormant until disturbance releases them. Carver knows Sir Reginald's habits. The baronet admires his treasures but rarely handles them, preferring to view them under glass. The victims will be those who lift or examine the piece: servants, guests, the heir himself. Carver visits frequently, encouraging the display of the mask, perhaps even suggesting it be shown to visitors. Each death weakens the direct line and enhances his prospects. With Sir Reginald and his son removed, the estate falls to him, or, should suspicion arise, he stands ready to purchase it cheaply at a forced sale, posing as a sympathetic kinsman, anxious to preserve the family home. I could not repress a shudder at the cold-blooded ingenuity of the scheme. But why risk selling the mask at all? Why not simply introduce the poison into food or drink? Holmes shook his head. Too direct, too easily traced. Poisoning invites post-mortem examination, chemical analysis, suspicion of those with access to the kitchen. Here the deaths appear natural. Acute pneumonia, galloping consumption, baffling the doctors, suggesting a curse. The mask itself provides the perfect misdirection, an exotic relic, ancient and mysterious. Who would suspect a living Englishman when an Aztec priest seems to exact vengeance from beyond the grave? He knocked out his pipe and rose with decision. The chain is complete save for one link, Carver's own betrayal of guilty knowledge. Tomorrow we shall supply that. I have already drafted a note to Sir Reginald suggesting that the mask be packed for immediate transport to the British Museum for expert examination and safekeeping. Carver shall be invited to attend. A man may control his words and expressions, Watson, but the eyes will betray him when he believes his deadly engine is about to be dismantled. Thus the stage was set for the final act. As I retired that night, I reflected upon the strange and terrible path that human greed may tread, and upon the extraordinary insight that enabled Sherlock Holmes to unravel even the most cunningly woven web of crime. The following morning dawned bright and frosty, with a thin winter sunlight glinting upon the waters of the Solent, visible from the windows of Netley Grange. Holmes had risen early, as was his custom when a case approached its climax, and by the time I descended, I found him in the drawing-room, the mask already removed from its pedestal and resting upon a baize-covered table, surrounded by packing materials, cotton wool, tissue paper, and a sturdy oak case lined with zinc. Sir Reginald, though pale and hollow-eyed from a sleepless night, had followed my friend's instructions to the letter. A note had been dispatched to Mr. Felix Carver the previous evening, informing him that, in light of recent events, the mask was to be transferred immediately to the British Museum for safekeeping and expert examination, and expressing the hope that, as the gentleman who had originally facilitated its acquisition, he might attend to offer any advice upon its packing. Carver arrived punctually at 11 o'clock, driving himself in a smart dog-cart. He was a man of middle height, with sandy hair, a carefully trimmed moustache, and an air of easy assurance that did not quite conceal a certain restlessness of manner. He greeted Sir Reginald with every appearance of solicitous affection, pressed Holmes's hand with warmth, and bowed politely to myself. His eyes, however, strayed continually toward the table where the mask lay exposed. "Terrible business this," he said, shaking his head. "I confess I was shocked beyond measure when I heard of poor Langdale's death. And to think that this beautiful object, which I myself recommended to you, cousin, should be associated with such tragedy, though of course it is all superstitious nonsense, the servants talk of curses and the like." "Quite so," replied Holmes smoothly. "Yet prudence dictates that the piece be examined by experts. The museum authorities are most anxious to study it, and I have undertaken to supervise its safe transport. Perhaps you would do us the kindness of inspecting the packing. Your knowledge of Mexican antiquities may prove invaluable." Carver assented readily, too readily, I thought, and approached the table. Holmes, with deliberate care, began to wrap the mask in tissue, but paused as though struck by a sudden thought. "There is one small point," said he. "When the mask was first unpacked here, was any notice taken of a possible cavity at the rear? I believe I detected a faint seam, perhaps a ritual compartment." Carver's face remained composed, but I saw his eyes flicker toward the exact spot Holmes had indicated, the back of the head where the obsidian plug was concealed. It was the briefest glance, yet to Holmes it was as damning as a signed confession. "Ah, yes," Carver replied, his voice steady. "Many such masks have hollow interiors. I seem to recall the dealer mentioning something of the sort, though I never examined it closely myself, of course." "Of course," echoed Holmes mildly. He now lifted the mask, turning it slowly so that the hidden cavity faced Carver directly. "Yet the seam is here, precisely here. One might almost suppose someone familiar with its construction had." At that moment, Holmes allowed the mask to tilt sharply. A faint haze of fine spores rose into the shaft of sunlight, visible for an instant before dispersing. Carver started back involuntarily, his face paling, his hand half raised as though to stop the movement. Holmes set the mask down with great care and fixed the man with a gaze as cold as steel. "Mr. Carver," said he quietly, "you betray yourself. Only the person who introduced the fungal culture into that cavity could know its exact position with such precision. The game is up." For a moment Carver stood motionless, his features working. Then, with a sudden access of desperation, he made as though to bolt for the door. But Holmes had anticipated the move. With a swift step he placed himself between the man and escape, while Sir Reginald, roused from his stupor, rang violently for the servants. Confronted with the evidence, the cultured mould in its dishes, the forged provenance papers, which Holmes had obtained from the original vendor by telegraph, the record of his debts and inquiries, it was but a matter of minutes before Carver's defiance crumbled. He sank into a chair, his head in his hands, and in a voice broken by fear and remorse confessed the whole infernal plot, the cultivation of the deadly fungus, its introduction into the mask, the calculated encouragement of its handling, the long patience with which he had awaited the extinction of the direct line. "Indubitably, my dear Watson," remarked Holmes quietly, as the local constables led the wretched man away, "the most deadly poisons are sometimes cultivated, not in the jungles of Mexico, but in the hearts of English gentlemen." Sir Reginald, overwhelmed with gratitude and relief, could scarcely find words to thank us. But Holmes, as ever, waved aside expressions of obligation, content in the knowledge that justice had been served and an innocent household delivered from the shadow of death. With the arrest of Felix Carver, the shadow that had so long hung over Netley Grange was lifted as though by a sudden gust of fresh sea air. The local constabulary removed the prisoner to Southampton jail, where he would await trial on charges that would ensure he troubled the living no further. Sir Reginald, though profoundly shaken by the revelation of such treachery within his own family, bore the shock with the fortitude of his class. He pressed upon Holmes a most generous cheque, which my friend accepted with his usual disclaimer that he was already amply rewarded by the interest of the case itself. The mask, that beautiful and deadly object, was dealt with under Holmes's personal supervision. In the sealed anteroom, he subjected the cavity to prolonged exposure to carbolic vapor, a disinfectant whose efficacy he had often demonstrated in his bacteriological experiments. When at last he pronounced the fungal growth utterly destroyed, the piece was packed with the utmost care and dispatched to the British Museum, accompanied by a sealed letter detailing its history and the precautions necessary for its future handling. I have since learned that it reposes there to this day in a locked cabinet, viewed only by scholars who are fully apprised of its singular and tragic associations. On the afternoon following the confrontation, we prepared to take our leave. Sir Reginald accompanied us to the door, where the dog-cart awaited to convey us to the station. His gratitude found voice at last in words that were simple yet deeply felt. "Mr. Holmes," said he, grasping my friend's hand, "you have saved not only my life but the honour of my house. I shall henceforth confine my collecting to objects whose history is less adventurous. Henceforth Netley Grange shall know peace again." Holmes inclined his head with that slight smile which betokened quiet satisfaction. "The peace you enjoy, Sir Reginald, is the natural state of affairs when reason triumphs over superstition and greed. I wish you many years to enjoy it." As the cart bore us down the drive between the bare winter trees, I could not forbear to comment upon the extraordinary nature of the affair. "A remarkable case, Holmes," said I. "One that might almost justify the more sensational headings of the popular press. An Aztec curse unmasked, a death trap from the tombs of Montezuma." He gave a low chuckle. "The press, Watson, will no doubt make what capital they can of it, should the facts ever become public. But for my own part, I find greater interest in the psychological aspects. Consider the patience, the ingenuity, the cold calculation required to devise such a scheme. Carver might have poisoned wine or tampered with a carriage brake, crude methods that would inevitably have pointed to murder. Instead, he chose a weapon subtle, delayed, and apparently supernatural, relying upon the very fascination the mask exerted to ensure its own employment. Yet, in the end, as always, it was over-elaboration that betrayed him. The perfect crime, Watson, is the simple crime. The moment a murderer introduces unnecessary complexity, secret chambers, exotic cultures, the paraphernalia of ancient ritual, he provides the very clues by which he is undone. The train bore us swiftly back to London through the frosted Hampshire landscape. As we sat in our first-class compartment watching the fields flash past, I ventured one final observation. "You remarked yesterday that the most deadly poisons are cultivated in the hearts of English gentlemen. A grim thought, Holmes." He gazed out of the window for some moments before replying, his keen profile outlined against the winter light. "Grim indeed, Watson, but true. The jungles of Mexico may yield their toxic fungi, the deserts of Egypt their ancient plagues, but the darkest poisons are those distilled by human ambition and envy. Against such venoms there is but one antidote, the light of reason, unflinchingly applied. While that remains, we need fear no curse, Aztec or otherwise." Thus ended one of the most singular investigations in the long career of Sherlock Holmes, a case that began with whispers of supernatural vengeance and concluded, as so many did, with the exposure of very human guilt. I set down this account in the conviction that it may serve as yet another illustration of my friend's maxim, that when all the impossible has been eliminated, whatever remains, however prosaic, must be the truth.